Welcome to Behind the White Coat podcast. I am your host, Eric Malara, a first-year medical student. In this podcast, we listen to the stories of those underrepresented in medicine or those with an exceptionally non-traditional background. I would like to thank David DeRoche for his guidance and the Quinnipiac University podcast for their support. Today's guest is Brooklyn native Dr. Gezzer Ortega, born to immigrant parents from the Dominican Republic. Dr. Ortega went to Syracuse University for his bachelor's degree and went on to receive his MD at Howard School of Medicine, where he also trained in general surgery and health disparities research. Dr. Ortega also received a Master's of Public Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He is currently the lead faculty for research and innovation for equitable surgical care at the Center for Surgery and Public Health, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. Dr. Ortega is a co-founder of the Latino Surgical Society, which aims to cultivate, nurture, and support the advancement of Latino surgeons. I'd like to begin with about the COVID-19 article that you help write. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on why it's so important to have diversity specifically in the medical field.
Well, thanks, Eric. And that's an excellent question. And there's a lot to unfold there. I think that diversity in the medical field is extremely important because you have to, one, it's important to have a workforce that reflects the population that they care for. And that's part of where the term underrepresented comes from, right? Is the fact that we're not represented equally within the population, our workforce. But I think that the question of diversity in our in medicine, it stems from multiple things. I think the first comes from making sure that we have a workforce that reflects what we look like and what our population looks like. It is also important for us to have physicians of color within leadership so that we can continue to develop the pipeline and also nurture our students of color who are coming in. One of the things that is really important is also having someone to serve as a role model or just mentors that have some level of concordance that has been demonstrated to help a lot and to not only help, but also motivate students of color within their career trajectory and training. But also, most importantly, our physicians that come from these diverse backgrounds have a diverse perspective that needs to be brought to the table and needs to be reflected in the work that we do. We don't want to miss out on opportunities because we don't have, or someone didn't consider something that they may have not thought about.
Speaking with other classmates, they feel like coming from an underrepresented group gives them an extra layer of imposter syndrome. So like a lot of medical students come in, they already have an imposter syndrome wherever you come from. What are your thoughts on that though? Like, is it important that we kind of call it like underrepresented groups, or what are like the benefits and the cons to that?
Well, I think that it's important to acknowledge that we are underrepresented in medicine, right? And so that's probably one of the more commonly used terms now is underrepresented in medicine, or UIMs. And I think the acknowledgement is important. I also think that with regards to imposter syndrome, it gets multiplied, and it can get multiplied when you're in medical school. The reason I say that is, as someone who is of Latino background, first generation, coming from a poor, low socioeconomic neighborhood, you get to medical school and you realize that if about 80%, if not more, of medical students in the country come from a household that lies within the first 2 or the first top income quintiles or quartiles. And so there's also, when not only does there exist like a racial ethnic gap, but then there's also a socioeconomic gap that I needed to kind of transcend as well. And it's reflected in a lot of like my close friends I have who are underrepresented in medicine, but have parents who are doctors or come from higher income, if not like middle income backgrounds. And so it's multiple layers, not just like racial ethnic minorities, but also socioeconomic. And then, you could even add in like gender identity and other different identities in which someone can like continue to feel different. But I think it's important for students to recognize that you got accepted into medical school. You're there because you worked hard and you deserve to be there. And it's hard to feel that way when there are not that many people that look like you in that setting, but you have to kind of push through it and excel. But for the same reason, because there are not so many, I mean, I've had mentors who would constantly tell me, you need to be twice as great to be half as good. Right. And so this culture of excellence is perpetuated because you know that everyone has expectations of you that may not be what you want, or maybe more the ones that society has put upon us versus what we believe we can achieve.
And you mentioned that you've had to overcome as well, not only just the racial and ethnic identity, but also the socioeconomic hurdles that you've had to come through. So can you talk to me a little bit about like growing up? I know you're from Brooklyn, but what was it like growing up for you and kind of the struggles that you had as a kid in high school?
Yeah, no, growing up in Brooklyn was rough. I mean, I grew up in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. My parents had just immigrated to the United States from the Dominican Republic about a year before I was born. And all of us were learning English at the same time. And so navigating the country, the educational system, the healthcare system. And then I had, without knowing the language and like, figuring out what resources are available and already being in a low resource setting made it a little bit more challenging. I was fortunate enough to have excelled at school to get into specialized programs in schools that allowed me to then kind of leapfrog into better academic settings that then set me up for success. But it is not the path for many of my friends growing up and where they currently ended up and like what has happened and the things that I've seen growing up. And so it is very, it's very humbling, but it also reminds me of why I do some of the work that I do and why I focus so much on health equity, because growing up, that was a reality for me. And it still is as a practitioner today.
And can we expand on, you said like that wasn't the route for many of your friends. What was their kind of goals? Did you share the same goals in terms of, let's say, education? It was more in junior high school and in elementary school. It wasn't something that was commonly discussed. There was just not a lot of us that were even thinking about college. And so it wasn't a conversation that was had at that level. It wasn't until I got to high school, and fortunately I went to a magnet school or specialized high school in which college was, the minimum expectation. And learning about schools and universities, I mean, I didn't know what an Ivy League school was until I got to college. So I was a sophomore in college. And then looking back at knowing the grades that I got in high school and my SAT scores, I could have easily gotten into an Ivy League school, but I didn't even think to apply because I didn't know that existed. I didn't know that there was a difference in going to these top tier schools or these, and I was happy where I ended up. And I was fortunate to get scholarships, but I looked at getting scholarships and I was like, oh, I'm super lucky, not knowing that I was really super competitive for those scholarships. But again, without the guidance and the mentorship and just knowing exactly, what the opportunities were, you're limited as to how far you can kind of go when you don't know what opportunities exist for you out there. So for you, do you think it was more of an internal thing of just being competitive? And you said you didn't know like what Ivy Leagues were, and you just kind of, you worked hard and you got into college and you didn't find out like what Ivy League was until your sophomore year. I know you said you had great guidance, but where does like that strive for doing well in education come for you?
So honestly, it came from sports. So sports drove me to excel in school because it was the only way that I could do what I wanted to do athletically. And so I got good grades for most of my like junior high school, elementary school, right? And then when I got to high school, I started playing football and organized football and on the varsity team. And so like wanting to play more and do that, there were minimums that we needed to maintain in order to stay on the team. But also it became, because I went to a school that was my colleagues and my peers were relatively competitive. There was always this like internal friendly competition to excel and to do well. And so that kind of kept me there, but also my coaches were my parents would always instill in us like a strong work ethic. And more importantly, like, I remember as a kid, like, don't do it if you're not going to, put 100% effort. You might as well not do it. And so having that work ethic along with wanting to excel in school so that I could continue to play sports were some of the things that drove me early on in my career. So I'll just add one more thing about the high school and just growing up. So I grew up with in a house of four siblings. It's four of us all together, and we're all pretty close in age. And so there was rarely a quiet moment in the house. And so I say that because to this day, I'm still an early bird, because growing up, I would wake up at like 4:30, 5 a.m. just to study, because it was the only time that it was quiet enough to actually read or like just do work in silence, because it was hard. I mean, to like do work in the evenings, the TV's on, my siblings are running around, everyone's like doing stuff. There's no, it's just really hard to sit and concentrate. And so I would just get up early and do it. And to this day, like I still am an early bird. Like I still have a habit of waking up very early and getting things done. And then eventually some of my siblings will wake up with me and do work, or it just became something that would happen where we would just wake up and get things done before our day started, because it was quiet and no one would distract you because none of your friends were up yet, and no one to say, hey, to come over and want to play and do other things.
When does medicine come in? Was that like, what was your idea of just like a doctor or medicine at a young age for you?
Medicine really started becoming an option for me in college. I was in high school. I was interested in computer science. And even when I applied to college, I applied mainly for computer engineering, bioengineering majors, biology majors. But I was really interested in a career in engineering and either a computer scientist or a bioengineer, because I like biology. And when I got to Syracuse University, I immediately switched my major from biology to biochemistry, because I didn't want to study botany and zoology. I was like, I want to study the human, like just human beings and not other life forms. So I switched to biochemistry, which was great. And then I just did information management and some computer science classes as minors. But it was my exposure during the summers in between my undergraduate years, where I did summer research programs at NYU and at Cornell, that really gave me like my first real exposure to medicine, to academic medicine, to research, clinical research. And it kind of inspired me to pursue that as a career. I knew that it was almost like kind of I figured it out by thinking about the things that I didn't want to do. And I got to the point where I was like, well, medicine is pretty cool. It will continually challenge me. I can teach, I can do research, I can help people, I can serve my community, I could also make money. And so all those things made the field attractive. And so it was just a matter of like, okay, well, how do I get it? Like, how do I become a doctor? What do I need to do to get there? And those summer programs are critical in helping prepare me for that and teaching me like what the steps were and what I needed to do to get into medical school.
When you were young, like what was your idea of a doctor? And the reason why I asked that is because I have a classmate, she's African-American female, who's from Brooklyn as well. And she was telling me that she remembers that she didn't even see her first African American female doctor until she was like 14. Her understanding and her friends and her community of medicine just wasn't there. So what was it like for you, like your understanding of healthcare in general?
It was, so coming from the community that I came from, it wasn't pervasive, right? You didn't have doctors everywhere. It's not like I knew a doctor growing up. And I mean, the only doctor that I had exposure to was my pediatrician. And I don't even remember what my pediatrician looked like. I think that most students of color, especially if you come from a low income background or you just never had any illness, serious illness, I mean, the only doctor you really have exposure to is a pediatrician. And it's no wonder why when most students of color get to medical school or they start applying for or thinking about medicine, a vast majority want to do pediatrics because it's really the only field you have exposure to. Mm-hmm. Unless you were, one of the students who broke a leg and then met an orthopedic surgeon or had some other like medical condition that forced an interaction with a doctor. Most people don't have those stories. And so my experience with medicine was really primary care until I got to medical school. I didn't really understand the different types of surgeons, the specialties, the complexity of medicine, the fact that you have physiatrists and radiologists and, radiation oncologists and all these different specialties. All that was new to me and something that I learned about in medical school.
Right. And that's something that I spoke with Dr. Arenas is these pipeline programs, right, to get students of color into medical school. But then, the next phase, it seems like to actually have them succeed and go into these specialties. This is just something that I've noticed too, that you've said is a lot of students of color want to go into family medicine or pediatrics because they feel like they have to give back to the community, right? So, and a lot of them have this sentiment of like selling out. Like if I go into like surgery or all these specialties, like I won't be serving my community. So what was the process for you to go into surgery? Like you said, your only exposure was pediatrics and now you're going into surgery. So what was that process like for you?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I never really looked at it as selling out, going into surgery. I think that when I got to medical school, my parents are not doctors and it doesn't matter what type of doctor I would have become, they would have been proud of me regardless. And I remember having the conversation with my parents and my dad and saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing surgery and this is, this specific field of surgery that I'm interested in. And he was like, oh, there are different surgeons. I was like, yeah, well, we have this type of surgeon for this, that. He was like, oh, okay. Because under his impression, he was like, oh, a surgeon was a surgeon. There was only one type.
Right.
Which I think that a lot of people probably assume, right? If you're not familiar with the healthcare system and what has occurred. But I think part of it is when you get to medical school, the first 2 years or first year and a half, depending on what school you go to, are really spent on basic sciences and learning the foundations of like medicine and theoretical medicine. And then you do your clinical years or your clinical year. And when you get into your clinical year, that's when you get that exposure to surgery, OBGYN, family practice, internal medicine, and other specialties. And when you do those, that's when you really kind of get a feel for what those specialties are and what medicine, a little bit more about what medicine has to offer. But what you start to realize is that if you decide then that you want to do something, it's a little late for the competitive specialties. And so because you have to apply for residency at the end of third year. And so when you decide that, okay, I've done my surgery rotation as my last third year rotation and I love this and this is great, but you now need to apply for residency in less than a few months, it doesn't give you much time to put together a very competitive application for residency for something that's already competitive. And so for me, the sellout is more saying, okay, well, I don't want to pursue this anymore because I don't think I'm competitive, and I'll just do something that's not as competitive. But so I don't know. And I don't see either as a sellout. I just think you do what you love to do and you just keep moving forward. But it is a challenge when you learn late, like what you want to do. And I think that happens to a lot of students of color because we just don't have the exposure early enough, right? Like if I had exposure to some of the subspecialties prior to medical school or very early on, then it may be easier to make that decision and then prepare your application throughout those years. So now when the end of third year comes and you're ready to apply for residency, you have a competitive application for a neurosurgery or urology or orthopedic surgery or something, or, any other specialty that you may want to do that's competitive.
You said that you probably would have felt more of a sellout if you didn't try for surgery as opposed to picking something else.
I mean, a personal sellout, right? Because I think you have to do what you love to do, right? Like I think that you find what you are, what you're passionate about. And every field is going to have its pros and cons. None of them are perfect, but you find the one that's a best fit for you and you commit to it and you go all in.
What are your thoughts on getting more students of color into competitive specialties?
I think that exposure early on is important. And there have been some pipeline programs, Anthem Mentions being one of them, that has provided that exposure to medical students early on in order to diversify the competitive specialties. And so the first challenge is getting more students of color into medical school. But once you get them into medical school, exposing them to all the different specialties and providing adequate exposure so that students can make an early decision, a decision early on as to what they want to, or if they want to pursue that competitive specialty. But I think the first step is exposure.
Talking about exposure, can we talk about the Latino Surgical Society, which you are a co-founder of? Can you tell me a little bit about what that is and why you started it?
Yeah. So the Latino Surgical Society, we started it because of a conversation that a couple of the co-founders and I were having. We were in our training and we were discussing one night. There happened to be a night where a few of us happened to be on call, and we all come from different institutions, but we were realizing that the number of Latino surgeons across the country for some of these specialties, when we sat there and we tried to go through all the trainees that we knew and some of the faculty that we knew, we could count in some specialties all of the people in that field within our two hands.
Wow.
And we were like, wow, that's really, it's sad, but it's also like, wow, that's a problem. We need to do more to increase Latino surgeons. And most of us were also part of the leadership of the Latino Medical Student Association as medical students. And so we already had a natural sense of okay, well, we want to lead in surgery. We want to make sure that we provide services for Latino surgeons because we need to do a better job of recruiting more Latinos to surgery, but also making sure that we retain them once they are in surgery. And so with that, we thought, well, are there any Latino surgical societies out there? Mm. And you realize that there are none. And wow. And so we said, okay, well, we need to create something. And it took about 2 years, maybe a little bit more to even start it. And one of the things that I always find fascinating is that even when we were creating our social media accounts, the term Latino surgery had not been taken at all. So, in an era now where there's so many
everything's taken
and everything is taken, right? You try to create a social media account with something, for the most part, it's always taken. But no, Latino surgery was not taken at all. So it was a wow moment for us. Wow, this was. And so we formed the organization in 2017, and since then have been working to increase the membership, increase awareness of the organization, and build its infrastructure. It's going to take time, and I think that it's going to continue to grow. But already it's been fun. It's been impressive, the impact that I feel like we've had so far. And also, it's allowed us to link so many different Latino surgeons and continue to learn about what other people are doing out there, and also to know that people exist. Like, a lot of people were just happy to know that, oh, wow, that organization exists. I would love to be a part of it, because prior to that, they had not known of anything like this.
Why do you think it is so important to have, and we'll just keep it to Latinos specifically because it's the Latino Surgical Society, but why do you think it's important to have more Latinos in surgery?
I think it's important to have Latinos in surgery for multiple reasons. One, surgeons, especially trauma surgeons, critical care surgeons, are frontline workers within surgery, right? I think that trauma surgeons are taking care of patients with penetrating blunt trauma, and unfortunately, those injuries occur at a disproportionate rate in our communities of color. And so having surgeons that are from those communities and can relate to those patients is extremely important and can hopefully improve care. But I think that helps. I don't think it's necessary. Even within other specialties, the fact that you have a surgeon that speaks your language, a provider that can speak Spanish makes a big difference for Latino communities. But also tailoring our message to those communities are important, from like surgical oncologists. And when we talk about anything from breast cancer to colon cancer to lung cancer, or any one of the cancers, having a surgeon that's sensitive to your culture, to your needs, and to the things that are unique to the Latino community, provide an extra level of concordance of care that is not usually available to our community. And so and then not only that, but then also in fostering the next generation of Latino surgeons. It's great to have role models and to have people that you can kind of admire, but also serve as mentors and provide guidance for the next generation. And so there are many reasons. I think those are just some for the need for Latino surgeons.
And you mentioned earlier that you've also learned a great deal from starting this campaign. Can you expand a little bit more on that? Like, what have you learned since you've started it?
You start to learn that, well, even as a medical student, I understood that just the Latino community is extremely diverse, right? Mm-hmm. We're not a monolithic culture. We have, in the Northeast, there's a lot of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. In the Southeast, you have a lot of Cubans. The Midwest, you have a lot of Mexicans, and everyone's everywhere. I mean, you could find any like nationality of Latino within any region of the country, but you have these these groups that are like, more represented than others within the Latino community. And so even within our group, right, there's still a lot of diversity that exists. And even some of the language. I always joke, one of the things, I'm from Brooklyn, right? I'm from New York, and I trained in DC, and just remember going down to DC and using the word ahorita and telling my patients, voy a regresar ahorita. And they would look at me like, oh, you're going to come back now? And I'm like, huh? And the reason is because for Dominicans, ahorita is later. Mm-hmm. So to me, I was just telling them like, I'm coming back later. But it wasn't until I had, one of my patients from Central America who was like, no, ahorita means now. And we kind of got into this, like what ahorita means. And there was no right or wrong. Right, it was just, in Mexico, Central America, right? Like ahorita just means now. And for me, it meant later. And so it's the same exact word, obviously with two different meanings, depending on where you're from. And so and there are a lot of words in Spanish that are like that. Mm-hmm. And so I had to kind of learn that even right within our own Latino community, there's still so much diversity in the culture, in the language, which I think makes it fun. It makes it interesting. It's great to learn about other cultures and then bring that to our organization, the richness of all those cultures. But then I've also learned that just a lot of other of other people who are in other places, other surgeons who have reached out and, they're like, hey, I'm the only Latino surgeon within my department, or, I'm the only Latino surgical resident at, where I'm at, and kind of hearing their stories and their perspective has been motivating, but it's also an opportunity to inspire and to uplift those that feel a little bit more isolated. And then it's also been an opportunity to unite everyone, right? To let them know, like, hey, you're not alone. There are other people at these other programs and these other locations that share your story, and are there to support you.
I think many people think that you can only join a group if you come from that background. For example, being part of the Latino Surgical Society only if you're Latino. But what has been the response to maybe people who don't fit into a particular group?
Well, I should say that my perspective has always been that you should lead by example. So I'm a member of the Society of Asian Academic Surgeons. I'm a member of the Society of Black Academic Surgeons. I'm a member of other societies and organizations that have a unique a unique focus on certain groups. And even though I may not identify with that group, as I still believe in the cause, and I still believe in what that organization is trying to do. And so I truly just believe that as long as you support the cause of the organization, it's okay to be a member. And so when people tell me, well, do I need to be Latino to be part of your organization? I'm like, absolutely not. I mean, we focus on Latino health and Latino issues, but anyone can be an advocate for Latino health or Latino issues. You don't need to be Latino in order to do that. And then you start to also realize that, in order to grow your membership base and to help support your organization, right? It's what all these schools and what we all try to do, right? Inclusivity, right? Like, you have to be inclusive, right? That's the only way we're going to get better and to work to a better society, is to be inclusive. It's not to try to push people out of our organization, is to say to someone that they can't be a part of it, but more for people to recognize that there are differences among us, right? And we should celebrate those differences, but we should also embrace them and use them to come up with diverse perspectives to solving some of the problems that we have in our healthcare system, and coming up with innovative solutions, because you have such a diversity of individuals in your organization and diversity of thought. But I will tell you, every single pre-med student that I mentor, one of the conversations that we have at some point, especially very early on, is I want you to join all the student organizations that exist. So I want you to join a PAMSA, AMSA, SNMA, LMSA, whatever, right? Because every organization has resources that are unique to their organization that I want you to tap into and utilize all of it, right? Like, there's no reason why you could pay, you pay your membership fee and you just and learn about all the different opportunities that these organizations have. Like, why limit yourself to just one? You can be a part of all of them. And if you decide that you like one more than the other, or you want to get involved in one organization more than another, then you do so. But no reason to limit yourself to, or feel like you need to just put yourself into a group or an org just because what society says that you need to be identified as.
What are some tips maybe you could give us as medical students, regardless if it's first year or your fourth year, to maybe be a mentor, be a leader in this field?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is identify a mentor, seek out someone that you admire, someone that you aspire to be or look up to. It could be locally at your institution, it could be regionally in your area, or even someone who's remote now. As we see with technology, distance is no longer a real barrier to connecting with someone. And so that's the first step, is identify a mentor. And then as you work with your mentors, then, you start to maybe work with one or two mentors to kind of learn from them. And as you foster that relationship, you also start to build your mentees, and you start to practice mentorship, right? And you start to think about, well, what are the great things about my mentors? Because I want to make sure that I reflect those upon my mentee, and what are the areas of growth or opportunities that I can probably expand upon or do better. There's so many times where you may see something and you're like, you know what, when I become a doctor, I'm just going to do it better than that because I think it could be done better. And it's the same thing with mentorship. I think that there are so many things that we learn and we need to just kind of improve upon so that the next generation has it better than we did. And so I would say that, you know, a lot of it is mentorship, building that cycle of mentoring, and continuing to just strive to learn as much as you possibly can. I think it's really hard because medical school comes so fast. It's so much material in such a short amount of time that it sometimes can become a challenge to just take a pause and think about like what you want to do and what the future looks like. But it's important to do that.
In medical school, did you have mentors that you could relate to in terms of like background, or how did that work for you finding mentors?
So for me, med school, the first 2 years were just, you go to school and you get, you know, the best grades you possibly can get. Mm-hmm. That was it. I was like, go to class, do those things. And it wasn't until when I started, and I had some people that I admired and people that I looked up to during my early years in med school. And most of those individuals some of them were also outside of my med school, because I had some friends who were now at that point in time residents who can kind of, you know, provided me with some advice and kind of like what to do and how to navigate med school. But it really wasn't until my third year where I've met like two of my mentors who were extremely significant in like my career and like getting me to where I'm at today. And then who also introduced me to other mentors who have now all have served as my mentors. And I feel like I'm fortunate to have an amazing group of mentors who are truly invested in my success and have guided me through these next steps, because it really makes a difference in like just how fast things were happening once I got a mentor. Like I felt like my career just accelerated. I was like moving along and I was like, okay, I'm doing well. But like once I had like great mentorship and just guidance, like it was just a lot more. I was able to be more efficient, make great decisions, and just have someone that I can bounce like critical and decisions off of and get honest feedback.
We are close to wrapping up here, and I just want to thank you. And it was really powerful to hear you talk about mentorship and leadership. Are there any final thoughts on your behalf?
I think that excellence, and part of excellence is being diverse. I think leadership is something that is important. It's not easy to do. It requires making some tough decisions, but also a lot of humility. And I think that I'm inspired by you and the things that you're doing to create this venue, this opportunity for other students to hear these stories. I think they are important because our students sometimes don't get to hear this enough, but there are a lot of students out there who are striving to achieve the goals that you have achieved so far, that have achieved so far, and still a lot of work that needs to be done. You know, at the very least, I always like, if I could do anything, my like most important goal is just at the very least to inspire. And that's what I hope this does.
Thank you for joining me on another episode of Behind the White Coat. Please make sure you subscribe either on iTunes or Spotify so you can get notified when the next episode is released.